Today's guest star, Benny. He hasn't been in one of the videos yet. It's usually Connell's. That's my finger. Hi. Big face. Oh my god, my glasses are filthy. Hold on. I'm Bryden, as a man skipping down the road. It's GCSE revision time. Whoop whoop. I'm Bryden, actual teacher, actual Buddhist, doing revision for GCSE, religious studies, Edexcel, specification, and today we are doing Buddhism, crime and punishment. Ooh, exciting. All right then, what is likely to come up in the crime and punishment topic? Well, it covers justice, causes of crime. Obviously, because we're doing Buddhism, there's some stuff about karma and why bad things happen. It covers the aims of punishment. What is the point of punishment? We look at forgiveness and reconciliation. We look at the treatment of criminals and, of course, capital punishment, the death penalty. Let's start with a ponder. Oh, you know I love a ponder. What is justice? What does it mean that justice is served, to get justice for somebody? Being a teacher of teenagers, usually when we start talking about justice, they immediately think of revenge, payback. But revenge is personal. Justice is bigger than that. Let's go with a working definition of justice is getting what is deserved. Think of karma as a force in the universe. For Buddhists, it is the law of cause and effect. Our actions have consequences. So it's a force or a law in the same way gravity is. Karma is not a god. There's no judgment on us. It's also not instant. It is about actions having consequences. And so for people who believe in karma, it does have a huge influence on how your thinking about justice develops. It completely rules out the need for revenge. There's no need for me to seek payback because karma will do it for me. So there's a really useful source of wisdom and authority for the idea of not having to seek payback because karma is going to work for us. Buddha talks about it in terms of a creeper strangling a tree. And he says, as the creeper strangles the tree, so an immoral person does to himself just what his enemy wishes him. I remember my mum, if I'd been naughty when I was little and I was upset about being punished, it was always that idea, well, you brought this upon yourself. Karma will get us in the end. That brings me to the aims of punishment. There are many aims of punishment, and this is going into a sociological approach to crime and punishment. I've taught my students 4 main aims of punishment, some of which are followed by Buddhists, others would be rejected. So we've already talked about the fact that Buddhists don't really believe in retribution. There's no personal payback required. The other aims of punishment, apart from retribution, are protection. We need to lock dangerous people away from society. They need to be banished from our communities for the protection of everybody else. We've also got the concept of a deterrent. A deterrent is the idea that if you put a strong penalty on an action, then people won't do it. And there's lots of arguments about whether deterrent works and when it works. And our other aim of punishment is reform, that we want to take somebody who's committed a crime and help them to change so that they won't reoffend, or even if they're never going to come out of prison, that they can reform in terms of admitting guilt and responsibility and recognising the hurt that they have done to others. So our 4 aims of punishment: protection, retribution, reform, deterrent. And of those 4 aims of punishment, the most important for Buddhists would be reform. They're not going to seek retribution. Instead, it is about taking even the worst criminal and helping them to reform to become better people. And we can see this a lot in the Dharma. we'll have a look at a few sources of wisdom, authority, and key people who showed reform. In our exam specification, one of the sources of wisdom and authority that's mentioned is the story of Badali. Badali was a bhikkhu who lived in the Sangha with Buddha. And under the rules of the bhikkhus, every morning they would go out to beg for their food, and then monks are encouraged only to have one meal a day to stop being too greedy. But Badali was not happy with this. Badali wanted to eat a bit more. And so he transgressed, he broke the rules, and he feels so bad about this that he actually leaves. He leaves the Sangha. So we could talk a little bit there about protection. His bad influence doesn't corrupt the rest of the monks. But eventually he's really sorry. He realizes that he wants to be a part of the monastery. He wants to follow the rules, and he goes back and is asked if he's sorry, and he's very sorry. He asks forgiveness and he is pardoned. And in fact, Buddha talks about that being so important for our growth, admitting our mistakes, changing, and then being forgiven for it. So he was able to be reconciled with the other bhikkhus. So bad boy Badali, the renegade bhikkhu, is forgiven and reintegrated into society. It's just a nice, easy example of reform. My favourite source of wisdom and authority, anything to do with crime and punishment and reward, is the story of Angulimala. Angulimala means necklace of fingers, which gives you a little hint of what's going to happen in this story. In the Dharma, it's quite a complex, deep story with lots of nuance. For our GCSE purposes, we're going to have to get it down pretty quick, so I'm going to give you the gist of the story. If you're interested in reading it up for yourself, you can find it online, and it is worth doing. Story of Angulimala. So I have heard it said that once there was a young man who was a terrific student, much like all my lovely students. He always put his best effort into everything. He obeyed his teachers. On the first thing they asked him to do, he would do it straight away. He was a great student. But some of the other people in his class were jealous, weren't impressed with this young man's diligence, and they wanted him to fail. So they managed to corrupt their teacher. They get their teacher to set Angulimala a horrific homework. And the teacher agrees to this. The teacher agrees to set Angulimala the task of bringing 1,000 little fingers. Now, I guess Angulimala could have taken these from corpses, but his diligence to the task, he equips himself with weapons and he goes off to do exactly as he has been asked to do. And he starts killing people for their little fingers. Now, at first, Angulimala chops off the fingers and he nails them to trees so he can go back later and count up how many he's got. But the birds start coming and eating the fingers, and he won't have that because he's got to hand in 1,000 little fingers. So he starts making them into a necklace, stringing them around his neck. He's also hanging out a lot in the woods at this time. He becomes quite a wild person, wearing animal skin, his hair's unruly. I think his criminal activities and murder is sending him quite insane. And Angulimala becomes this feared presence in the forest. People are told, oh, don't go to the woods, Angulimala will get you, necklace of fingers guy will get you, and people stay away from him. So he's racking up all these murders, getting all the fingers, wearing this bloody, gory necklace. And of course, who should happen to be walking in the woods? It's old Buddha, in his robes, walking peacefully through the forest. Happens to be on the day that Angulimala has already got 999 little fingers, and he's looking for that 1000th finger to complete his task. And he sees this old man walking in the woods. This will be an easy victory. I will get my last little finger. And he chases after Buddha with his weapons. And Buddha just walks slowly through the forest. And no matter how fast Angulimala is running, I must get my finger, he can't catch up with Buddha. And Buddha just walks serenely through the forest. Angulimala chases him. Eventually just yells, "Stop!" And Buddha very gently says, "I have stopped. Will you? I have stopped forever violence towards any being." And in the presence of Buddha, a huge change sweeps over Angulimala. And he swears never again to hurt anybody. And he reforms. And he becomes a bhikkhu. We'll leave that one in. He becomes a bhikkhu with the Buddha. But meanwhile, the king of the area is trying to hunt down Angulimala. You can't have a murderous, finger-stealing, monstrous man in your kingdom. And so the king comes riding into the forest, hunting Angulimala. The king encounters Buddha and the monks and describes this hideous beast of a man that they are after. And Buddha says, "Oh, but if you were to encounter Angulimala with his head shaved, living as a humble monk, could you forgive him?" And the king says, "Well, I could, but of course that's never going to happen, is it?" And then Buddha does the big reveal. Look, it's Angulimala, all changed and peaceful. With the moral of our story being anybody can be reformed. And through the power of forgiveness and reconciliation, we can bring about a more peaceful and just society. And the name Angulimala has been taken by the UK Buddhist prison Chaplaincy. This organisation goes into prisons to work with prisoners, often very long sentences, to help them to reform. And they also work with aftercare for when prisoners have been released and to help them reintegrate into society. It is a charity that works entirely on the principles of reform and reconciliation. In the US, there is also a big Buddhist prison chaplaincy service. One particular man who stands out to me is a man called Fleet Moore. He was convicted of a very violent offence when he was younger, and he served 17 years in a maximum security facility. While he was there, he converted to Buddhism and he became a Buddhist monk. He wrote materials for other inmates to help them learn to meditate, to help them to become mindful, to work on this reform of character, to rid himself of the three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And he's devoted his life to working with prisoners, including those on death row. So it's not going to be reform in terms of release, but it is going to be reform in terms of character and acceptance of one's crime, and hopefully some reform in terms of admitting guilt and finding forgiveness if possible. So what types of punishments do Buddhists agree with? You can't just let people off, obviously. If we take our aim of protection, sometimes criminals are going to have to be removed from society for our protection. And this does exist as a concept within Buddhism. Banishment was a possible punishment for bhikkhus who needed to be apart from the rest of the monks. And in our society, we banish people to prison. So Buddhists would agree with those punishments that have an element of restorative justice. For example, community service. Instead of a jail sentence, somebody might be given work such as cleaning the streets or cleaning up graffiti, making our communities a bit better and restoring some of the harm that the criminal might have done. Buddhists would not be in favour of any corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is that which physically hurts us. For example, beatings or whippings, that's corporal punishment, and that would not be acceptable within Buddhism. A key source of authority for this is when the bhikkhus are arguing and they're falling out with each other, and Buddha admonishes them saying, no, you've got to use empathy. All fear the stick, all fear punishment, and we can't use fear to punish. It doesn't work. So no physical punishments allowed. The whole concept of deterrent as an aim of punishment is a very, very interesting one. It's very complex. So if you think about it in everyday life, we have deterrents like fines, parking tickets. They're all deterrents. If you do this thing we don't want you to do, you're going to have to pay a price for it. And deterrents seem to work when they are small things. Deterrent does not seem to work for any violent crimes or even murder. You look at the states where the death penalty is used, the states where there is the highest amount of executions also have very high murder rates. If it was the case that deterrent worked for that, there shouldn't be any murders in those states, but there are. And then if we look at a predominantly Buddhist country like Thailand and their system of crime and punishment, we can see that they are attempting to use deterrent. Bang Kwang prison in Bangkok is famous for its really, really huge penalties for anybody bringing drugs into the country. You're looking at 99 years in prison or the death penalty. That's quite interesting from a Buddhist perspective that Thailand has capital punishment. What is fascinating in Thailand is that they have the death penalty. All Buddhist teachings about violence clearly show that violence is unskillful. It is to be avoided. The first of the precepts is to avoid harming any living thing. Buddha told us to put down our weapons, told us that all fear the stick, all fear punishment, all fear death. And yet here we have this predominantly Buddhist country, Thailand, who still execute. Let's explore how that is happening. If a person is caught smuggling drugs into Thailand, you will be given either a 99-year sentence if you confess to the crime. If you don't confess to the crime and you are found guilty, then it is a death sentence. And the means it is carried out is through lethal injection. However, all death row prisoners are given the chance of a pardon. So there still is this emphasis on reform there. Very few executions are ever carried out in Thailand. Instead, people can appeal directly to the royal family and ask for a pardon. Your sentence then can be commuted to a life sentence. And if, for example, you are a British citizen, you can also make an appeal for the rest of your sentence to be carried out back in your own country. This has happened several times. So although Thailand does have the death penalty as a deterrent to those who would bring drugs into the country, they very rarely use it. And clemency can be given if you appeal to the king. So it does fit in with a Buddhist idea. Oh, someone's messaging me. It does fit in with a Buddhist idea of reform and mercy for those prisoners. Let's do a quick for and against for capital punishment. We don't have it in the UK, but it is still carried out in many countries around the world. Methods such as hanging, decapitation, lethal injection, amongst the most common. The main arguments that people put forward for the death penalty is that it's the only real way to get justice for the victims. If you take a life, you forfeit yours. Of course, there's another strong argument in that They are not going to re-offend. They are dead. They cannot hurt anybody else. On the other hand, there are big problems with miscarriages of justice. In the UK, there was a very high-profile case of Timothy Evans, who was wrongfully executed for the murder of his wife and child. The real killer, John Christie, got away and went on to kill again. You must be absolutely certain that you have the right person if you execute them. What are you going to do? Dig them back up and say sorry? Not to mention that you leave a killer to go on to kill again. There is also the idea that if you keep somebody in prison for life, and that does happen in this country, a lot of people think it doesn't, it does happen in this country, like Levi Belfield, you actually are giving them a much tougher punishment than execution, which might be seen as a quick way out. For example, Ian Brady, one of the Moors murderers, he begged to die, he wanted to die, but he was kept alive in prison until he did die, never ever being released. Probably one of the most fascinating parts of this topic is what causes crime. What is it that influences some people to actually break the law and others remain law-abiding citizens their entire life? And it is a really complex question with even more complex answers. But for the purposes of our GCSE, we're going to have to summarise, and we're going to have to do them quite quick. So let's have a look at ideas around the causes of crime. When we look at crime statistics in the UK, you can see that there is a big correlation between areas of social deprivation and criminal activity. Of course, it's too simplistic to say those who grow up in poverty will become criminals. I know plenty of people who've grown up in the most adverse conditions but have gone on to be extremely successful, happy and productive people. And there are plenty of people who've grown up with the most supportive of parents, with money in the bank, but have still become criminals. But if you start to look at the impact of social deprivation on communities, you can see how this might lead to more criminal behaviour. In communities where there is lots of provision for the youth, lots of groups to join, lots of activities for young people to do, then they're more likely to join in with those rather than hanging around on the streets and coming into contact with criminal behaviour. In areas of social deprivation, substance misuse figures are often higher. So if there are people with addictions, then sometimes criminal activity is embarked upon as a way to feed those addictions. And then you get a correlation between addiction, criminal behaviour, to feed the addiction by criminal behaviour, and so on. When it comes to thinking about the causes of crime, there are two main ideas about why people turn to crime. On this side, we have individualists. Individualists believe it's down to us as individuals whether or not we do crime. It really is a choice. And individuals who give in to crime are seen as weak-willed, somehow given into temptation, greedy, but they are individuals and they make a choice to do it. On the other hand, there are collectivists who say it's not as simple as making a choice. We are all products of our upbringing, our environment, our culture, and the values that our society has. So if a young person has been neglected, that they don't have a nurturing environment, that they don't have strong role models, then they're more likely to be heading towards a life of crime. When it comes to individualism versus collectivism, Buddhists, like most of us, probably take a little bit of both. Buddhists believe that we are all corrupted by the three poisons, those three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance. If you give in to those three poisons, then you're more likely to take that criminal route. But Buddhists also recognise the influence of our societies on us, That's why they make sure they support charitable projects in schools, with families to support them, so that we get the best chance of making those right choices. It's a lot easier to make those right choices about criminal behaviour when you're sat in a lovely environment with loving parents who make sure that you are helped with your homework and give you lifts to school and have a plan for college and have saved for you to go to university. Those choices become a lot easier than for somebody who is trying to manage on their own. Throughout our thinking about crime and punishment, I've kept touching on the ideas of reform, of forgiveness, and reconciliation. These are really important concepts to Buddhists. We saw with Angulimala and Badali, both people who were reformed, and both people who were reformed by Buddha specifically. But there is another really good example to use, and that is of Devadatta. You would think that everybody loved Buddha. Absolutely amazing guy, so generous, so wise, converts people to goodness just by talking to them. But Devadatta was having none of it. He was Buddha's cousin, and he was always jealous of him. He wanted to lead the Sangha. He convinces like monks to follow him, and he's like, right, but I'm going to be the boss of this now, not you. And it doesn't really work. So Devadatta comes up with the plan to have Buddha killed. On 3 separate occasions, he tries to have him murdered. He sends assassins, but the assassins meet Buddha and they're like, I'm not killing him, he's great. He tries to squish him by a drunk elephant, but Buddha calms the elephant. And Devadatta then tries to push a boulder on top of Buddha as he's walking past, but it doesn't work. But each time that Devadatta does these terrible things, but it does not show him any hatred. Key source of authority with that one is that hatred is never appeased by hatred, only love. He doesn't seek revenge on Devadatta. He doesn't have him beheaded. He doesn't seek capital punishment. He's always looking for reform and reconciliation. So we've nearly covered everything. I think we've done causes of crime, we talked a bit about karma, the aims of punishment, protection, reform, retribution, deterrence, talked about capital punishment. We talked about the treatment of criminals with the Angulimala prison, Chaplaincy, Fleet Mall's work, talked about forgiveness and reconciliation. There is a wee bit more in this topic that talks about just the general why do we suffer ideas. So let's wrap up with looking at that big old question, why do we suffer? It's got to be one of the big old age-old questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? Christians talk about the problem of evil as a philosophical concept. My class like to sing the problem of evil to help us remember it. Let's have a little go. It goes something like this. If God is benevolent and he's omniscient and he's omnipotent, then why is there suffering? I apologise for my ludicrous little jingles. The problem of evil. If God is all-loving, all-powerful, and he knows I suffer, why doesn't he help? This has been a problem for Christians to try to solve, and solve it they do through their theodicies. So they come up with ideas like, well, it's a test. It's a test to see if you're still faithful, just like old Job in the Old Testament. He had all these riches, he had servants, he had a beautiful wife, he had family. God starts taking everything away from him to see if he will remain faithful, and he does. So that's one theodicy, suffering is a test. Another one, sometimes a little bit more uncomfortable, but maybe you're being punished by God. There's a lesson you need to learn. Or maybe just the idea that this world is not meant to be perfect, because that's the point of heaven. For Buddhists, suffering is not a problem. I don't mean that in terms of our own suffering. I mean in a philosophical sense. There is no problem of evil for Buddhists, because there's no benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient God for Buddhists. Instead, we come right back to that key source of wisdom. Buddha says, I have come to teach one thing. I have come to teach suffering and an end to suffering. So there's no conflict with this idea of this world being full of suffering. That's the first noble truth. Everything that lives suffers. The only problem is then about what we can do about it. So as Buddhists, we go on that path to try to relieve suffering of others, and eventually, hopefully, to escape the wheel of life and stop suffering altogether. But in terms of, is there a problem of evil for Buddhists? No, because there's no benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient God. There is suffering in the world, but it's up to us to relieve it. That's Crime and Punishment revised. I have put together a little playlist of other Buddhist videos that might be useful to you. Anyone got any suggestions, just send them my way as well. So if you're watching this video and you're not one of my students, then welcome. I'm amazed that you would even find it. I make these videos for my students at my school who are absolutely wonderful and they deserve every success in their exams. So if I can do just a little bit to help them get a better grade, then that's all for the good. Thanks to all my students. I can't give you shout outs, but you know who you are. You're always making me laugh. You always put a smile on my face, and I wish you every success in your exams.